The porcelain vase shattered against the marble floor before anyone in the room had time to breathe. Kang Ji-Hoon stood over the pieces, chest heaving, eyes blazing with a fury that seemed to fill the entire hall of the Kang family mansion. A young maid knelt at his feet, hands trembling, apologizing over and over for a mistake so small nobody else would have noticed it. A coat hung on the wrong hook. A schedule read 1 hour late. "Do you have any idea what that vase cost?" Ji-Hoon snapped, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Do you have any idea who you work for?" The maid said nothing. She only cried, harder, shoulders shaking, while 6 other household staff stood frozen along the walls, eyes down, breath held, waiting for the storm to pass the way they always did. Then the door opened, and a new maid walked in carrying a silver tray of tea. She was Amara Williams, 24 years old, newly hired, and completely unaware of the scene she had just stepped into, or perhaps entirely aware, and entirely unmoved by it. She set the tray down calmly on a side table, straightened, and looked directly at Ji-Hoon, instead of lowering her eyes the way every other person in that room instinctively had. Ji-Hoon turned toward her, momentarily thrown by the absence of fear in her expression. "Do you know who you're standing in front of?" he demanded. Amara studied him for a long moment, unhurried, unbothered. "Yes," she said. "A very unhappy young man." The room went utterly silent. Somewhere behind her, one of the maids gasped audibly. Ji-Hoon's jaw tightened, and for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, he had no immediate response. 3 weeks earlier, none of this would have seemed possible. Kang Ji-Hoon was 22 years old, the only son of Chairman Kang Tae-ho, one of Seoul's most powerful and most feared underworld figures. He had grown up inside walls most people only saw in magazines. Imported cars in the garage, private security at every gate, tailors who visited the house instead of the other way around. He had never once, in his entire life, wanted for anything material. What he had wanted, and never received, was far simpler. His mother had died when he was 12. His father, unable or unwilling to process his own grief, had responded the only way he knew how. With money, with staff, with distance. Nobody in that enormous mansion ever taught Ji-Hoon what to do with the anger that filled the space where grief should have lived. Instead, he learned that anger got results. Anger made people move, made people obey, made people disappear from a room the moment he wanted silence. The household staff had one unspoken rule that governed every single day inside the Kang mansion: never challenge the chairman's son. Amara Williams had heard the rule within an hour of arriving. "Don't make eye contact with him," one of the older maids warned her, voice low, even though Ji-Hoon was nowhere nearby. "Don't question anything he says, and whatever you do, never, ever tell him he's wrong." Amara only smiled, unbothered by the warning. She needed this job, badly. She had 2 younger siblings depending on the money she sent home each month, and building a new life in Seoul hadn't been easy for a foreigner with no family connections and no safety net beneath her. She wasn't interested in the Kang family's criminal empire, their reputation, or their money beyond the paycheck that let her keep her siblings fed. She simply intended to do her job well and go home each night with her dignity intact. Ji-Hoon tested her within her first week. He gave her contradictory instructions on purpose, asked her to prepare one room, then accused her of ignoring him when she followed the second set of directions he'd given only minutes later. "I told you to leave that room untouched," he snapped, standing in the doorway with his arms crossed. "You told me the opposite 10 minutes ago," Amara said calmly, setting down the cloth in her hand. "I have the message you sent the housekeeper. Would you like me to show you?" Ji-Hoon stared at her, momentarily caught between fury and confusion. Nobody corrected him. Nobody dared. "You think you're clever," he said. "I think you're testing me," Amara replied, "and I think you already know I passed." His face darkened. He stepped closer, using the height and presence that had cowed grown men twice her age. "Careful," he said quietly. "People who challenge me don't last long in this house." Amara didn't flinch. "Being feared isn't the same thing as being respected," she said. "You should think about which one you actually want." The other maids in the hallway stared at her, as though she had just signed her own termination papers. Ji-Hoon turned and walked away without another word, his fists clenched at his sides, angrier than he had been in months, though even he couldn't fully explain why. For the first time in years, someone had challenged him without hatred in their voice. It unsettled him more than any threat ever could have. Amara began noticing patterns almost immediately. Ji-Hoon's cruelty wasn't constant. It spiked, sharp and sudden, whenever certain subjects came up in conversation. His mother's name, old photographs, the anniversary of a date nobody else in the house seemed to track but him. The pattern crystallized one afternoon, when Ji-Hoon stormed through the East Wing, accusing Amara of moving an item from his private study, a small wooden box he kept locked away and rarely mentioned. "I didn't touch your study," Amara said firmly. "I haven't been in that room in days." "Someone moved it," Ji-Hoon shouted. "Nobody else has access. It had to be you." "Then look at the footage," Amara said. "Because I know I'm telling the truth, even if you don't want to hear it." Ji-Hoon's fury didn't cool. If anything, it burned hotter, fed by years of accumulated grief he had never once processed. Amara, hurt by the accusation despite her calm exterior, finally reached her limit. "I'll have my resignation ready by morning," she said quietly. She turned to leave, and something in Ji-Hoon's chest tightened at the sight of her walking away, though he refused to name the feeling. "Wait," he said, and his voice cracked in a way it never had in front of staff before. Amara stopped, but didn't turn around. "You don't treat people badly because you're strong," she said, still facing the door. "You do it because you're terrified someone will see how hurt you really are." She left the room. Ji-Hoon stood alone in the silence, and for the first time since his mother's funeral, he felt something crack open inside his chest that he had spent a decade sealing shut. Amara didn't resign the next morning. She told herself it was because she needed the money. She suspected, quietly, it was because some part of her had already decided this young man was worth one more chance. While cleaning an unused wing of the mansion days later, Amara discovered a locked room nobody had mentioned during her orientation. Curiosity, and a missing set of keys she'd been asked to return, led her inside. The room was untouched by time. Photographs of a woman with Ji-Hoon's same sharp eyes and softer smile lined every wall, a woman Amara immediately recognized as his mother. Dust coated every surface except a small desk in the corner, where a single sealed envelope sat, addressed in careful handwriting to My Ji-Hoon on his 18th birthday. The envelope had never been opened. The birthday it referenced was 4 years in the past. Amara stood in that silent room for a long time, envelope in hand, and understood immediately that whatever had shaped this man's cruelty went far deeper than grief alone. Someone had kept this letter from him. Small changes began appearing in Ji-Hoon over the following days, changes so subtle that most of the staff dismissed them as temporary. He noticed, for the first time, when the maids looked exhausted after a long shift. He stopped raising his voice in the kitchen. He quietly arranged for a broken appliance in the staff quarters to be replaced, without anyone asking him to. "Don't get comfortable," one of the older maids whispered to Amara in the hallway. "He always goes back to being cruel eventually. This house has seen it before." Amara wasn't so sure this time was the same. She watched Ji-Hoon closely, and what she saw looked less like performance and more like genuine, uncertain effort. A man trying to unlearn a decade of habits with no idea where to start. But she also noticed something else, something that troubled her far more than his temper ever had. Certain incidents inside the mansion never quite added up. A misplaced item that conveniently triggered one of Ji-Hoon's worst outbursts. A rumor that reached his ears at exactly the right moment to poison his trust in a particular staff member. A pattern too precise to be coincidence. Amara began paying closer attention to Director Choi, the family's longtime advisor, a soft-spoken man who had served Chairman Kang for over 15 years and who always seemed, quietly and conveniently, to be nearby whenever tension flared inside the household. She found herself watching him the way he had clearly been watching everyone else. If you've made it this far, you already know this story is about to escalate fast, so make sure you're subscribed before the next twist hits, because you will not want to miss what happens to Amara next. Drop a comment letting us know honestly whether you think Ji-Hoon can actually change, or whether some wounds run too deep to heal. And if this story already has your heart racing, tap that like button right now, because everything is about to get far more dangerous. The danger arrived sooner than Amara expected. Word moved through the mansion in hushed, frightened whispers. A rival organization was making moves against the Kang family, testing weaknesses, probing for cracks in an empire that had ruled Seoul's underworld for over 2 decades. Security tightened overnight. Extra guards appeared at every gate. Chairman Kang barely left his office. Phone pressed constantly to his ear, voice sharp with attention the household staff had never witnessed from him before. Ji-Hoon, still raw from his slow unraveling, made a reckless decision. He confronted one of his father's rivals directly, without permission, believing he could prove his worth to a father who had spent a decade treating him like an afterthought. The confrontation nearly cost him everything. He returned to the mansion bruised, shaken, and furious with himself, in a way that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with fear he refused to name out loud. Amara found him alone in the garden that night, staring at nothing, hands still trembling slightly from adrenaline that hadn't yet faded. "That was reckless," she said, sitting down beside him without waiting for permission. "I had to do something," Ji-Hoon muttered. "I'm tired of being the son who does nothing, while everyone treats my father like he's already lost control of his own empire. There's a difference between doing something and doing something smart," Amara said. "You could have died tonight, Ji-Hoon. For what? To prove a point to a man who barely notices you're in the room?" Ji-Hoon said nothing for a long moment. "You're the only person in this house who's ever spoken to me like I'm not made of glass or gunpowder," he finally admitted. "Maybe that's because I'm the only one who isn't afraid of either," Amara said. It was during this same tense week that Amara, cleaning near Director Choi's private office, overheard a phone conversation that made her blood run cold. Choi's voice, usually so measured and calm, was sharp with barely restrained urgency. "The shipment records need to disappear before the chairman's people find them," Choi said quietly into the phone. "And make sure nothing points back to me. If the boy figures out what I've done, this whole operation collapses." Amara pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, and listened as Choi described feeding information to the very rival organization threatening the Kang family, using his position of trust to sabotage the empire from within, all while manipulating Ji-Hoon's grief and anger to keep him isolated, dependent, and too broken to ever notice the betrayal happening under his own roof. She had found her answer. Director Choi wasn't protecting the family. He was destroying it, piece by piece, from the inside. She tried to warn Ji-Hoon immediately, but when she described what she'd overheard, doubt flickered across his face. "Choi has worked for my father for 15 years, Ji-Hoon said. "He practically raised me after my mother died. Why would he do this?" "I don't know his reasons," Amara said, "but I know what I heard, and I know the shipment records he mentioned tonight are the same ones your father has been searching for all week." Ji-Hoon hesitated, torn between the instinct to dismiss her and the growing awareness that Amara had never once lied to him, not even when the truth cost her comfort or safety. "Even if nobody else believes me," Amara said quietly, "I needed you to know, because I'd rather you be angry at me for being wrong than in danger because I stayed silent." That single sentence broke through every wall Ji-Hoon had left standing. He spent that night reviewing security footage himself, cross-referencing shipment logs, tracing financial transfers that Director Choi had spent years carefully obscuring. By dawn, the pattern was undeniable. Every incident that had poisoned Ji-Hoon's trust in the household staff, every rumor that had fed his isolation, every manipulated argument that kept him dependent on fear rather than connection, led directly back to one man. Choi hadn't just betrayed the family's business interests. He had spent years deliberately keeping Ji-Hoon broken, because a broken heir was easier to manipulate than a whole one. Ji-Hoon confronted his father with the evidence that same morning, hands shaking with an emotion that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, but some devastating combination of both. "Why didn't anyone tell me the truth about anything?" Ji-Hoon demanded. "About Mom? About Choi? About any of it?" Chairman Kang, for the first time in years, looked genuinely shaken. "I thought protecting you financially was enough," he admitted, voice low. "I didn't know how to face my own grief, so I buried myself in this business instead of facing yours." "I failed you, Ji-Hoon. I see that now." Ji-Hoon broke down in front of his father for the first time since childhood, not out of a desire for revenge, but from the exhausting realization of how many years he had wasted building walls instead of asking for help. Before either of them could fully process the moment, Director Choi made his final, desperate move. Evidence appeared, planted with careful precision, suggesting Amara had been the one leaking confidential shipment information to the rival organization all along. Security surrounded her within the hour. The household staff watched in stunned silence as she was accused, publicly, of betraying the very family she had quietly tried to protect. "She stole from this family," one of Choi's loyal security men insisted, presenting falsified documents to Chairman Kang. "The evidence is clear." Everyone in that room expected Ji-Hoon to react the way he always had, with fury, with immediate condemnation, with the fear-driven certainty that had defined him for a decade. Instead, he asked one calm, deliberate question. "Where is the original footage? Not the summary, the raw footage, time-stamped, from every camera in this house on the dates in question." The security guard hesitated. Choi, standing nearby, betrayed the faintest flicker of panic. Ji-Hoon spent the next several hours reviewing every frame personally, cross-referencing Amara's actual movements against the fabricated evidence, until the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. The footage Choi had submitted had been edited, timestamps altered, key sequences removed entirely. "You don't get to destroy someone's life because they're easier to blame than the truth," Ji-Hoon said, standing between Amara and the men who had come to detain her. The household staff stared at him, stunned. This wasn't the young man who had once made a maid cry over a broken vase. Something in him had genuinely, irreversibly shifted. Director Choi, realizing his plan had collapsed, attempted to flee the mansion that same night, with a case full of documents meant to disappear his 15 years of betrayal along with him. Ji-Hoon caught him at the gate. "You could have just let me stay broken," Ji-Hoon said quietly, blocking his path. "It would have been easier for you." "I didn't create your pain," Choi said, cornered. "I simply used what was already there. That makes it worse," Ji-Hoon said. "Not better." Instead of resorting to the violence that defined his father's world, Ji-Hoon called the authorities directly, laying out the evidence of embezzlement, sabotage, and manipulation with the same calm precision Amara had once used against him. Chairman Kang, watching his son handle the crisis without a single raised fist, felt something shift in his own understanding of who his son had become. Director Choi's 15 years of quiet betrayal collapsed in a single night, undone not by fear, but by truth. Days later, Ji-Hoon gathered the entire household staff in the main hall, the same room where he had once shattered a vase over a maid's small mistake. "I owe all of you an apology," he said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability in it. I made you afraid of me because I didn't know how to deal with my own pain, and it was easier to make you carry the weight of it than to face it myself. That wasn't fair. None of you deserved that." The maids, who had spent years flinching at the sound of his footsteps, stood in stunned, emotional silence. Amara, standing near the back of the room, didn't rush to forgive him completely, and she didn't pretend the past few weeks had erased years of fear built into that household. "Changing isn't something you announce," she told him afterward, quietly, just between the two of them. "It's something you prove, every day, long after anyone is watching." Ji-Hoon nodded, accepting the weight of her words without argument. 20 days passed, and the mansion Amara had first walked into felt almost unrecognizable. Ji-Hoon greeted the staff by name each morning. He helped his father navigate the family's slow, complicated transition toward legitimate business ventures. He visited his mother's memorial every week now. The sealed letter finally opened, read, and kept safe in his coat pocket, rather than locked away in a forgotten room. The same maids who once went silent when he entered a room now laughed freely in the kitchen, unafraid for the first time in years. On the day her contract came to its natural end, Amara packed her belongings and made her way toward the mansion gates, prepared to say a simple goodbye and continue building the life she had come to Seoul to find. Ji-Hoon was waiting for her there. "You didn't have to come say goodbye," Amara said, though something in her chest warmed at the sight of him. "I wanted to thank you," Ji-Hoon said, "for everything." "I didn't change you, Ji-Hoon," Amara said gently. "You changed yourself. I only told you the truth when everyone else around you was too afraid to." Behind them, Chairman Kang watched quietly from the doorway, pride evident in his expression for perhaps the first time in years. Not pride in his son's power or his family's empire, but pride in the simple, difficult act of a young man choosing to become someone better. Sometimes the person who changes your life isn't the one who saves you from danger. Sometimes it's simply the person brave enough to tell you the truth about yourself, even when you're not ready to hear it. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved us telling it, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because stories like this one are exactly what this channel is built for. Tell us honestly in the comments. If you were Amara, would you have stayed and helped Ji-Hoon change? Or would you have walked away the moment he showed you who he really was? We read every single comment, so let us know where you stand. Thank you for watching until the very end, and we'll see you in the next story.